Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's session. You're on with Michael Downey, and it's great to be here for another AWRI webinar. This is the fourth session for the 2019-20 program. Previous sessions looked at weeds in the vineyard, frost forecasting tools, and a new vineyard mapping app called Gaia. Today's session looks to be equally exciting and explores a range of maceration techniques helping winemakers tailor sensory attributes and style. But before I jump over to today's speaker, a couple of quick reminders for the audience. To provide a question or to ask a comment, please open the Q&A section of the webinar, type in your question and click to send it through. If you'd like to get involved through Twitter, please use the Twitter handle @_AWRI. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to view later this afternoon from the AWRI's YouTube channel. All registrants will receive a link to view this recording after the session. Now, for those of you that have just joined us, welcome. Today's webinar, which takes a look at using maceration techniques to tailor red wine style, will be presented by our speaker, Dr. Keren Bindon, a research manager here at the AWRI. Keren's career has centred on understanding the grape-to-wine interface with a focus on factors affecting the extraction and conversion of key compounds from grapes. Keren also has a strong interest in demonstrating meaningful outcomes of her research to the grape and wine sector, with today's webinar being a great example of that. Keren has recently participated in winemaking trials that applied a range of maceration techniques to understand the impacts of wine style. So it's fantastic to have her expertise on hand for today's webinar. So enough from my end. Keren, it's great to have you here, and I'll hand over to you to get started.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for signing up to be part of this webinar series today. It's exciting to actually get to the point in this work where we can start to talk about a number of trials that have been done at the AWRI. And so what this talk is really going to be aiming to do is to give a more of a holistic overview of what we've done, including some work from other researchers as well, and really to try and bring it home to what does this really mean for wine sensory attributes and wine style. So when we talk about maceration, we're really talking about techniques that for red wines tend to be phenolics focused. So if we think about how we can use maceration, there's various approaches and reasons for using it. One reason might be to actually accelerate maceration. In other words, to be able to get the must out of the tank earlier, or out off skins earlier, so that they can actually, you can free up tank space. Another reason for using maceration techniques might be to selectively extract certain phenolics or other compounds from the grapes. And ultimately, one can apply maceration to have an overall impact on wine style. And an example of this would be carbonic maceration, which is a unique wine style in and of itself. So what I'm going to be aiming with this talk today is to actually start to consider a few reasons why we might be using maceration, and ultimately to retain the wine quality that is intrinsic in the grapes that we're fermenting, and also to target consistent wine styles. So things I'll be looking at are, do the desired aroma or flavor attributes of that style track with phenolics as they're extracted during a maceration technique? And then also start to ask the question, are there certain phenolics or flavor attributes which may dominate wine texture or taste, which are perhaps undesirable or could be overshot? And then we'll ask the question, is there a cost benefit of using a maceration technique? For example, tank time or actually volume loss. So as I mentioned earlier, today's presentation will aim to review some maceration techniques we've done at the Institute and in collaboration with other researchers, and look at holistic expression of wine style, and then also look at the relative gains or losses of phenolics when we apply certain maceration techniques. So first, actually to look at comparatively at running a series of maceration techniques side by side. There was a series of 3 vintages done at the AWRI through the leadership of Consimos. And this aimed to look at comparing in a single batch of grapes a variety of extraction and also winemaking tools. I'm just looking at maceration techniques here today to see what the outcomes were on wine sensory attributes, but primarily to look at phenolics. So the first vintage was to look at Pinot Noir. And in this case, it was a 13.5 Beaumont harvest from the Piccadilly Valley in the Adelaide Hills. And you can see that various techniques were applied, with those red arrows there pointing to the control treatment, which just was standard crush and then fermented off on skins. And you can see there that compared to things like cold soak or saignée, there were only certain techniques that really produced a change in phenolics. The final technique that's compared there is the addition of pressings, which in this case was Chardonnay pressings. And that introduced a significant increase in tannin and also in color. And you can see that, for example, extended maceration produced far less of an increase in tannin, but also in some senses, one might not want to go as far as the pressings addition with Pinot Noir. In terms of color, there was very little change with all the different maceration techniques. And you can see there in that final step there that the pressings addition increased tannin. When we look overall at this effect, you can see that for tannin, from the control to the maximum was a 290% increase, which shows how much one could actually dial that measure up or down in Pinot. And in color, there was only a 57% increase from the control to the maximum. So moving on from here, what I'm trying to start doing is just to say, well, are there techniques that we need to hone in on more, or are there techniques that really don't make much of a difference? And also, of course, there's a variety-dependent effect here. So next, looking at Shiraz, which was the following vintage from Macclesfield at 13.4 Beaumont. And in this case, there was a wet growing season, so no later harvest was possible. So the first treatment there is the control. So you can see there that all the maceration techniques in this instance increase tannin. And in this instance, only a hot rapid ferment, which would be at 35 degrees, actually increased color. So with Shiraz, we could see a range of changes in tannin that occurred. But then again, simple techniques, for example, like just changing fermentation temperature, produced the largest effect. In this case was a 106% increase from the control to the maximum and a 26% increase from the control to the maximum in color. So looking then at Cabernet in the following vintage, this was a slightly later harvest at 14.5 Beaumont. And here we could see again that that hot rapid extraction introduced the largest changes in both color and tannin. And that for other techniques, for example, extended maceration, we saw the same with the Shiraz, but I didn't highlight that previously. There was actually a color loss while there was an increase in tannin. Here we actually included an enzyme treatment, which we'll get into a bit today, and saw that there was quite a large enhancement of tannin, but not so much for color. But again, considering what we saw with the previous techniques like cold soak, which didn't produce any effect in Pinot Noir, actually reduced color here for Cabernet. And we did see that for the Shiraz previously, that cold soak did increase tannin. But we really need to ask the question of, if the technique is going to be used, is it going to have a consistent effect? And we'll start talking more about that today. In this case, we saw a 62% increase in tannin from the control to the maximum and a 16% increase in color from the control to the maximum. So not very significant there. So when we talk about targeted maceration techniques today, so choosing tools to actually manipulate style and texture in the wine, we want to address techniques that we know are going to introduce an effect. So I will talk a little bit about cold soak, but we saw from these comparative approaches that cold soak was not generally producing a large change. So I'll be looking today at enzymes, yeast strain, extended maceration, saignée, temperature, differences during fermentation. Unfortunately, due to the nature of some of our collaborations and the inability to talk about some of that work, I won't be able to talk about techniques like flash détente at this point, but hopefully in the future we will be able to address that. I'll be mentioning carbonic and whole bunch maceration, and then some interesting new tools like mark addition, which we highlighted there first in that first slide with Pinot Noir, and a new technique called DTMA maceration, which is just recently on the market. So starting with enzymes. Enzymes generally are pectolytic for what we use in red wines. And although this can aim to increase filterability and also to increase the volume yield in the wines, What we have been using them for in our red wine making studies is really to try and understand their role on phenolic extraction, particularly looking at earlier harvests compared to later harvests, where we know that there's an increase in tannin and color with ripening, but to see what we could do with an earlier harvest to improve phenolic extraction. In this case, we looked at a study on Shiraz, which was published by a PhD student of mine, Saignee. And in this case, she looked at an earlier harvest at 14% alcohol compared to a later harvest, obviously a bit too far, at 16.7% alcohol. And then she applied a cold soak treatment and an enzyme treatment to that earlier harvest. The idea here was to see whether we could mimic a later harvest by increasing phenolics. So here we saw that cold soak really had very little effect. And in fact, for color, it was decreased by cold soak, but that the enzyme actually increased the tannin, which is on the left there, to the same level as a later harvest. However, it didn't have any effect on color. In this instance, there was no clear effect on any of the volatile compounds in the wine, so we would expect to see here primarily changes on the wine texture. So if we move there to look at the effect on the wine sensory, which is really where the story of these techniques becomes relevant, we could see there that the main attribute which was changed by the enzyme, which actually separated it from both the control and the later harvest treatments, was that there was a strong change in astringency and the surface coarseness of that astringency. So what we saw with this enzyme treatment was that the tannins were the same concentration, but they were in fact larger tannins, which we might expect could be more aggressive in the wine. So considering that other attributes were not changed, are these tannins too astringent and too aggressive? We have found other trials, for example, the first few slides that I presented, the Cabernet, where enzyme was actually a positive effect, but one does need to consider the batch of grapes that one's working with and what kind of effect one wants to achieve in the wine. So there's actually an easier way to look at enzymes and perhaps a safer way, and that's the fact that yeast strains actually have a natural pectolytic activity. And so a large trial that we conducted quite a few years ago now was looking at a variety of yeast strains, and we could identify 2323 as a yeast strain which consistently produced higher tannin in the wines, and then an AWRI strain 1503 which consistently produced both lower tannin and lower color in the wines. In this case, there was limited effects of volatiles, and we also saw polysaccharide concentration was the highest in 2323 as well. So we had both higher tannin and higher polysaccharide. Again, where's the story lies is in the sensory results. And what you can see here looking at this map of the sensory results, that 1503 was very clearly separated from 2323 in terms of astringency. So we expect that tannin increase to introduce a change in astringency. But importantly here, other important changes like viscosity, opacity, and dark fruit aroma also track together with that increase in astringency. And so what we saw here overall is that just by simply selecting yeast strain, one produced a number of beneficial effects together with the change in phenolics. So moving on from here, we wanted to understand, well, if we apply differences in yeast strain and then look at differences in maceration time, can we then see a variety of effects in terms of wine style outcomes? So we did a trial the following vintage to look at including those two strains, and then adding enzyme again, and then looking at extended maceration. And here we saw quite a wide range of tannin concentrations from 560 milligrams per litre in the control compared to 1,300 milligrams per litre in the extended maceration with enzyme. And this was 133% difference, which is quite large. If we compare the earliest treatments, you could see there again that effect of yeast strain, where 2323 had higher tannin. And then adding enzyme in this particular case didn't produce very strong changes in that relationship. Extending the maceration significantly increased tannin extraction for both of those treatments, but it wasn't as significant for the 1503 yeast. But interestingly, when we included enzyme and extended maceration, the 1503 and 2323 had very similar tannin concentrations, which again points to the potential for pectolytic activity in that 2323 strain, which was mentioned in the previous trial. In this case, we saw that color and non-bleachable pigments are important for the aging of the wine, were correlated with the changes in tannin, and they were obviously also then enhanced by extended maceration. Looking at the sensory results here, you can see there the 1503 treatments are all the green lines there, and the 2323 treatments are all the purple and pink lines. And looking here at those changes overall in sensory effects, we can see here that important changes like barnyard flavour and meaty aromas, as well as dark fruit aromas, were significantly affected by that treatment. But importantly, the change in using enzyme or extended maceration did not significantly separate the treatments from one another. So just by using 1503 compared to 2323, you could significantly increase dark fruit flavours. But then by applying extended maceration on top of the 2323 strain was introducing no further differences. Similarly, for effects on the flavour and palate, things like fruit aftertaste were increased by extended maceration, but also by using the 2323 yeast strain, as were dark fruit flavour, opacity, also increased, and purple colour, is important for those wine attributes, were increased. So even though we saw strong differences in terms of tannin and colour introduced by extended maceration, they weren't significant when one looked at the sensory attributes. So really simply by choosing a yeast strain, one could avoid that extra time in tank and actually achieve the same beneficial effects on wine sensory properties. In this case, we saw no effect on astringency, really just due to the variability across the treatments. So moving on from there, I've mentioned here techniques that one would want to select. One needs to make sure that there's a cost benefit. So we saw that simply by selecting 2323 yeast strain, one could introduce very similar effects to what one would achieve by extending maceration. Saignée is another technique where must is run off, and the idea here is that one will actually change the must to solids ratio and introduce a concentration effect in terms of the phenolics. So this was part of a study where we looked really at using Saignée more as a technique to add water to wine, but just to show you some of those results. It was Shiraz in the Barossa Valley in 2017, where we had a later harvest of 15.5 Beaumay, and juice was run off to 17% and 8%. And initially in those treatments, it was found that tannin and colour were increased by Saignée, but that after 18 months, there was the treatments really started to come together. So for the Saignée treatments, those values decreased. It's also interesting, you can see here from the visual that the Saignée wines also had browner colour. And then at the time of sensory analysis, the final tannin concentrations were very similar, and only a 7% increase in colour was seen for the 17% Saignée treatment. So really one can conclude that in terms of phenolics, the net effects of those proportional runoffs for the Saignée were quite minor. More so when one looked at the sensory data, and you've seen quite the large differences that I've shown in some of those previous slides. The blue lines there are just where Saignée treatment was actually replaced with water, and so please just ignore those lines. But really overall, with the exception of those water addition treatments, we see very little effect of Saignée on any of the sensory properties. So in terms of a cost benefit, using Saignée and losing volume in terms of winemaking may not actually produce the benefits in the long term. Now just quickly to address the topic of fermentation temperature. This is going to draw on work which was done at UC Davis in California, really because all the work that we did was just looking at those comparative trials, and at this stage we haven't done any further analysis or sensory analysis on those wines. But it's a very important point to mention, because in those early slides that I showed, comparing the different maceration techniques, we consistently saw that just increasing fermentation temperature actually increased phenolics, both tannin and colour. And from the anecdotal evidence of just what winemakers and our team have also seen, is that the dark fruit flavour and palate fullness were enhanced by that technique. So people might be a bit gun shy of applying high fermentation temperatures, but really what we've seen so far is that there's positive outcomes. The work at UC Davis looked at Cabernet, and this work's published, you can see there below. And what they found was that simply by increasing fermentation temperature, one accelerated skin tannin extraction. But then over the 30-degree mark, really that was accelerated, but also higher total levels were achieved, in this case due to a slight increase in C tannin extraction. There was a color decline when fermentation temperature increased, but really this was because of the conversion of that color to stable polymeric pigments. So it would be good to look at this in a bit more detail with future studies, but at this stage, I think it's a positive outcome and something worth looking at as a simple technique to use in the winery. That first slide that I showed, we talked about mark addition to wines. It was interesting to find that with the Pinot Noir, we saw a very strong increase in tannin and color. In the second slide on Shiraz, we actually saw that adding mark to wine stripped out some Shiraz color. So looking in a bit more detail at Pinot Noir, what kind of mark can we add? That earlier treatment, we used 20% mark addition. And again, this is work done from the University of Tasmania, where they added both fresh and fermented Pinot Noir skins to wines and found that it actually increased both tannin and color in this case, and with significant changes for wine color density. I actually said there that only fresh skin addition increased wine color and non-bleachable pigment. Please excuse me, but I actually went and got the data from the aged wines, and in this case, both treatments actually increased both of those measures. So what is interesting here is that one can simply take Pinot Noir skins, perhaps from a sparkling wine base, and add them to a Pinot Noir treatment and actually produce positive effects. But bearing in mind from that first slide that I showed you, those 20% additions of Chardonnay mark were actually too far. So the wines were a little bit too astringent. So it is easy to overshoot. And we could see there that it's limited to varieties. So additions to much deeper red varieties like Shiraz and Cabernet, we could see that it would strip out some color, even though it adds tannin, and that wouldn't be a positive outcome in those cases. I also just want to highlight some work that we've been doing looking at whole bunch fermentations. Firstly, just to draw back on those earlier slides where there were some treatments looking at carbonic maceration. So in this case, it's a technique where basically patented quite a while ago, where grapes are actually put under anaerobic or high carbon dioxide conditions at higher temperatures. And in this instance, the enzymatic non-fermentative reactions occur that cause kirsch, musk, and strawberry aromas to be imparted. And what this is due to is the reaction of shikimic acid enzymatically that actually degrades to cinnamic acids, and then these become esterified to ethyl cinnamate, which produces those kirsch flavors and aromas. What I want to really focus in on though today is looking at the combination of introducing those flavors, but also to look at effects on phenolics. So referring back to those earlier slides, so the AWRI trials were done in 2017 and 18, and in the first instance, Pinot Noir and then Shiraz. And in this case, it was 100% whole bunch fermentation. So introducing carbonic maceration early in the piece and then pressing off those grapes and then fermenting off on skins. So for the Pinot, it was 16 days carbonic at 21 degrees C, and then that fruit was crushed to 8.5 Baume, and then fermented for 4 days at 24 degrees C. That top graph just shows you there that tannin was slightly reduced in the Pinot Noir, but it was actually larger tannin, so slightly more C tannin in that instance. For the Shiraz, it had 18 days carbonic and then was crushed at 10 Baume, again fermented out at 24 degrees, but for 10 days. And you can see there that in that case, the tannin was higher, and as we mentioned previously, the color was the same. And again, here we saw slightly larger tannins, but there was no stem contact during ferment. So most of those larger tannins came from the skin. In this case, anecdotally, these wines were quite remarkable and had all of those kirsch and carbonic attributes that one would expect. But again, here in terms of cost benefit, it's definitely a style in and of itself, and that the differences of phenolics are not necessarily very large. We also did a number of trials at the AWRI on whole bunch fermentation. And in this case, we wanted to look at Adelaide Hills Pinot Noir and Shiraz as a bit of a cooler climate focus. And in this case, we looked at 0% all the way to 100% whole bunch. In this case, we looked at just adding an inoculated small amount of must to each ferment and then top that up with either whole bunches or crushed must, completely crushed must. We did look at doing whole berry fermentations, but then we realized with our crusher we couldn't get whole berries, so quickly changed to completely crushed in this instance. Just to quickly walk through the results, we saw that there was a strong extraction with both Pinot Noir and Shiraz of isobutyl methoxypyrazine, and that's that green capsicum flavor compound. And that's just extracted directly from the stems because it's not present in the berries themselves in this variety. And that increase was linear as whole bunch inclusion increased. A very, very strong linear effect. For the Shiraz and not for the Pinot, tannin was actually extracted from the stems. And again, very similar to the IBMP, that was a linear effect. And in this case, the tannin which came from the skins was larger tannin and more gallulated tannin, which we expect might lead to greater astringency. For Pinot Noir, we saw that ethyl cinnamate, the Kirsch-like flavor compound, increased linearly as well. And this may be a Pinot Noir effect, but it may also be partly due to some carbonic maceration, which may have taken place from the whole bunches. In this case, we did not attempt to do carbonic, but it may indicate that there was some carbonic going on in that case. In Pinot Noir, it was interesting to find that hue decreased linearly, which means that the wines were less brown. And this was actually just due to simply less brown pigments overall and not due to changes in the color itself. So this was an interesting finding in that case. Again, the proof is in the sensory analysis. And this graph just shows you moving from green to purple, how we move from 0 to 100% whole bunch. And the key attributes which changed here, which one would expect with that increase in isobutyl methoxypyrazine, was increases in stalky and capsicum flavor and aroma. Importantly there, we saw that there was a strong increase in astringency, so that tracked with that tannin increase. But here we also have a question around the type of tannin, so it's larger and potentially more aggressive astringent tannins. We saw also that there was decreases in red fruit aroma, and this was really not compensated by increases in dark fruit flavor with those wines. Moving on to the Pinot Noir, here we didn't see any effects on tannin, therefore no effect on astringency in this case. And here we saw that strong change whereby red color was increased and brown color in this case was actually decreased, whereas the effect on brown color was far stronger than a red color. There was important increases in red fruit aroma and confection attributes, which could be the contribution of that ethyl cinnamate. And again, we saw that strong increase in the capsicum-like aroma from the isobutyl methoxypyrazine, but importantly, decreases in a cooked vegetable attribute, which we cannot account for at this point in terms of the chemistry. So here we really see that using whole bunch maceration is a tool to diversify the wine sensory profile, potentially add complexity to the wines. But a strong cautionary note here is that the capsicum attributes, which come from the IBMP, is linear related to whole bunch inclusion. And therefore, using it should be considered very carefully in cool climate or high vigor areas. Although these wines were actually quite subtle in the effects introduced by whole bunch, one might introduce more excessive astringency in Shiraz. And interestingly, I think for Pinot Noir, quite a positive outcome where we saw some of those improvements in confection and red fruit aromas and the introduction of increased red color and ethyl cinnamate. So quite an important outcome for Pinot Noir in this case in terms of diversifying wine styles. Finally, I just want to share some information with you about a new technique called DTMA maceration. It's something that we're starting to look at more closely now. So this was initially done from work by Dr. Angela Sparrow from the University of Tasmania at that stage, and is now being patented by Della Toffola into what they call the Della Toffola Maceration Accelerator, which herewith shall be referred to as DTMA. Really what this does is just to accelerate the maceration of the grapes. And so the main goal of using this technique is to reduce maceration time, in other words, time in tank. But what we really want to understand is what it can do in terms of wine phenolic outcomes. So the work that Angela did earlier was primarily done in Pinot Noir, and she used this technique to really reduce skin particle size with the idea of facilitating colour and tannin extraction for Pinot Noir, which we know tends to be a much lighter variety. Her early trials showed that the approach did not damage seeds, and we've since confirmed that with other work. And so mainly the tannin that is extracted is coming from increasing the cut edges of that skin, so it's primarily skin tannin. Here you could see that just looking at cut berries versus control in the wines, there was significant increases in non-bleachable pigments, colour density and tannin, where we could see perhaps it's quite a high tannin for a Pinot Noir, but we'll go on from this to discuss how this technique can be used. Looking at the sensory outcomes here from that initial trial, looking simply at a control treatment and then a DTMA maceration treatment. In this case, they looked at submerging the cap or not submerging the cap and didn't see large changes due to that effect. But here it was found that with the DTMA maceration, there was important increases in red color and also dark fruit flavors, which were both on the aroma and the palate, but interestingly also an increase in the stalky flavor as well. The key effect here was that by introducing the DTMA maceration, there was actually a large increase in astringency and bitterness, but we also saw that very large increase in tannin, which occurred through that technique. And so, although this was early phases of the work and it's since been patented into a much more controlled instrument, it could lead to the question of whether this is taking it too far. Are these wines perhaps too astringent? So moving on from there, really the goal of using DTMA is to look at pressing off earlier. So another trial which Angela looked at conventional maceration on skins for 8 days, and then applying DTMA and then pressing off on a number of different days, running up to the full 8-day press off. And here you can see that from day 1, there was a small drop in color, but from day 2, one could see that color was equivalent or higher than the control, and tannin was higher from day 4 to 8 when one looked at DTMA compared to the control. So really one could theoretically do TMA and press off a lot earlier and achieve the same effects as a full maceration on skin. So this is really where this maceration technique counts. So what we're doing now is working in collaboration with some wine producers and repeating some of this work on Shiraz. And we're finding that these trials are showing quite subtle effects on wine tannin and color properties and wine sensory effects, really potentially quite beneficial. And so what we're wanting to look at further with this technique is to look at vineyard variability. So when one considers that a vineyard may have, or basically a producer may have vineyards which produce either variable tannin and have different seasonal effects, whereby one season may produce high color or low color, one might be able to apply this technique with an understanding of those vineyards and apply it selectively to improve the phenolic extraction in certain vineyards and perhaps then to avoid it for others where we have a strong phenolic extraction from those grapes. So this is where the research is at present. And so I just wanted to flag this as something that's a tool that we're looking at and which may have positive outcomes in Australia if used correctly and with earlier press-off times. So just to conclude from this talk, and thank you for your attention so far, some of the real take-home messages that I wanted to bring home today is that when one's considering, for example, even the DTMA that I've just mentioned, a technique should be applied when one considers the phenolic potential of the grapes. So one may not necessarily want to apply extended maceration to a very high phenolic potential batch of grapes. One may want to apply a mark addition for example, Pinot Noir, where one has very low extraction of phenolics and color. What we see also here is that maceration techniques don't consistently impact phenolics. So for example, we saw that for Shiraz, cold soak could actually increase phenolics in one trial, in another it didn't. And in other trials, it really did seem to have much impact. Another consideration is that, for example, like with the Saignee technique, you may see gains in phenolics and then these may be lost with aging. So with every technique that's applied, it's important to assess, for example, the cost benefits of applying that technique. So DTMA could be beneficial to reduce time in tank, but then Saignee might be not beneficial because of the volume lost with very limited gain in either flavour or phenolic attributes. So one can see here is that even when maceration techniques alter phenolic extraction, they may actually have very little effect on sensory outcomes. So for example, the work that I discussed about extended maceration, we saw that we could significantly increase phenolics with extended maceration, but that there really wasn't much effect on wine sensory outcomes. So simply by using a yeast, one could achieve the same effect. Another important point I wanted to mention was really that when we consider a maceration technique that's being used, we want to understand how that holistically affects wine style. So considering the whole bunch, for example, we saw that we actually increased capsicum aromas and tannin in the Shiraz. And so one would need to decide how far one would want to go with that technique in terms of affecting the overall style and potentially introducing green attributes. While in the Pinot Noir, we saw that it actually could produce quite a diverse, perhaps better sensory profile. Finally, just looking at all of the above, I think to just say that looking at simple tools like choosing a yeast strain that produces increased phenolics, but also positive flavour outcomes, and also just simple tools like ferment temperature changes may actually have more of a positive impact than using intensive maceration strategies. So this is also just a simple take-home message that I wanted to convey today. Finally, just to flag that we have some new techniques like DTMA, and hopefully in future I'll be able to talk more about flash détente. And these really do have the potential to optimize phenolics, but also reduce time in tank. And we need to look at this further across other varieties. So just to thank you for your attention today. And also just to say that I'm here for any further questions in the future, should I have forgotten something in my talk or not gone into enough detail in some of the part of this talk. But you can see here on this acknowledgements list a whole group of people who deserve recognition. So please take time to have a read of those people, but I'd like to thank them personally for their many years of support. And also, of course, to thank Wine Australia for their ongoing funding and general support to us and the industry. So at this point, it's time to close this talk, and I think I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Keren. Fantastic presentation and a lot of content that Keren's gone through there. So if you do have any follow-up questions regarding some of these trials or techniques, now's your chance to ask a question. Just a reminder to ask a question, open up the Q&A button on your webinar toolbar, type it and send it through. Keren will be sticking around for a little while, so please start sending through any questions you have now. Okay, so we've got our question here from Pete. Pete's asked, in one of the earlier techniques, sensory attributes, there was an increase in barnyard character. Was this a Brett character?
Well, thanks, Pete, for your question. I think you're referring there to that extended maceration trial. I'd need to double check, perhaps. Should we go back to that slide, Michael, and just have a look? Oops. I might have exited by mistake. Okay. I want to just...
Yeah, you can use this.
To go, it's going to be too many slides to go back to.
Okay, then just exit.
So can you show me, please? Oh, okay. No, I think it's definitely an extended maceration trial. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in this case here, that barnyard effect was just from the 1503 treatment, which was a yeast strain effect. So it was simply 1503 with or without enzyme, introduced that barnyard effect. And also, I think I mentioned increased meaty aromas. So here, the extended maceration essentially overcame that impact in the wine. And so because that was perhaps a ferment that had limited time on skins and it was treated, it didn't have the risk of exposure that the extended maceration did relative to the other treatments, because we were very worried about those extended maceration treatments either getting brat or going stinky. So I think really here it wasn't necessarily due to brat, although we didn't test that. I think perhaps here it was really just simply a yeast strain effect, which there was overcome in this instance by extending the maceration, but we didn't measure brat aroma characters in that instance. I hope that answers that question.
Great, thank you, Keren, and thank you, Pete, for your question there. If you do have any follow-up questions, Pete, please send them through. Another question here regarding the extended maceration, Keren. With high temperature, how long would you perform the warming?
Sorry, with the warming with high temperature?
So the question is, on the extended maceration with high temperature, how long would you perform the warming? And then a follow-up comment at 32 degrees.
Last bit of work that I referred to from the UC Davis study, where they did the differences in cap temperature and then also extended the maceration. So in this case, we don't have data on times of warming or how long at different temperatures one performed that maceration. So that Davis work, they really retained that cap temperature and must temperature constant throughout the maceration period. In our case, we would have had ferments really kept at 20 degrees for the fermentation, and I think then they were moved to 15 degrees to perform the extended maceration. So there was no warming step included in our extended maceration trials. If you'd like to follow up with more information on that question, I might be able to answer it better.
Okay, thanks for your question there, and Keren, thanks for providing some further insight on that one. Okay, it looks like that may be it with regard to the Q&A, Keren. Did you want to make any final comments before we start to tie things up?
Just my, oh, unmuted, okay, sorry. Just my final comments really would be that this is a work in progress, so we do continue to do these types of studies. If anyone does have ideas or important industry needs regarding some of these maceration techniques or wants to provide more feedback to me on relevant topics, please feel free to do so. I haven't provided my email address today, but I'm easily accessible on the AWRI website. And we'd really be interested in hearing more from industry about what is most important and relevant to you. And I said before, any further questions, please contact me.
Okay, thanks. While you've just been speaking, Keren, we have had a final question come in, and it's, what temperature was the 2323 yeast trial fermented at on the Shiraz?
That would have been 20.
Okay. All right, thank you, Keren. Yeah, I'd also like to thank the audience who's logged in and participated in today's session. Quick reminder for everyone, this session has been recorded and there will be a notification going out tomorrow with information about how you can access the recording. The next AWRI webinar is currently scheduled for Thursday, 24th of October. Unfortunately, as we speak, I can't confirm the specific contents of that webinar, but these details will be firmed up shortly, so please be on the lookout through the usual channels. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar.